really want to say thank you for joining us today for our GIGA Insights webinar. Our goal is to provide you with actionable information and inspiration to propel your solutions forward so that you can go GIGA. Our focus today is on deciphering the barrage of market signals that are coming our way and transforming them into strategies that can drive growth, customer acquisition, investment, and ultimately overall success in an increasingly complex and volatile market landscape. Over the past decades, we've heard this term VUCA to describe our current state of affairs. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I think it's safe to say that VUCA is the new normal and the name of the game. The pace of change that we are experiencing, whether it's technological, political, or socioeconomic, is unlike anything before. It's challenging to keep up, let alone stay ahead. And here we are, only 3 months into 2025, and we've already experienced what feels like a lifetime of events that have completely reshaped our context. And we know that there's so much more to come. I want to mention a few things. As we know, 2024 was a year of elections. There were more than 60 elections happening globally, and more people headed to the polls around the world than ever before. Obviously, this webinar has participants from many countries, but it must be mentioned that the US elections have resulted in a new administration that is shifting policies and priorities that impact all of us, no matter where we are located. And we'll dive into some of those ramifications in our discussion. I also want to tell a story. Back in January, which again seems like an eternity ago, I attended the World Economic Forum annual meeting in Davos. And I remember distinctly that the overall atmosphere there was very optimistic about the US elections and about potential deregulation and growth strategies that people were expecting to come forward. There was this overall enthusiasm too for advancements in artificial intelligence and the growth of infrastructure that could propel its growth. And then I got home, and 1 week later, literally a week later, a series of executive orders from the US introduced the threat of new tariffs and trade policies, the dismantling of US aid, chainsaw layoffs from Doge, and all of this led to market fluctuations and that feeling of like whiplash. Simultaneously, out of nowhere came DeepSeek, a Chinese AI startup that for a moment disrupted all of this positive news about the US AI industry, and it brought forward this cost-effective and efficient model and caused even more stock market shifts. This is just a couple of examples of the whiplash that we all can feel when we're trying to keep up with all of the changes happening around us. And when it comes to agri-food tech, we're not immune from this. We've seen over the past months corporate venture capital rolling back. We've seen investment dollars that have been in free fall over the past few years now leveling off. That said, there was a recent piece in AgFunder where they interviewed leading investors and thought leaders in the space around what their expectations for 2025 would be. And pretty much everyone said, be prepared for chaos, turmoil, and uncertainty. So in this environment, those of us who are committed to innovation and positive change must find ways to navigate all of this chaos around us, not just to survive, but ultimately to thrive. And that's why I'm delighted to be joined today by David Verbitsky, who's a longtime friend and colleague. His extensive experience spans investment banking. He served as CFO for notable agriculture scale-ups, and now he is the managing partner and president of Verbitsky Capital. Together, we're going to explore these market dynamics and discuss tangible strategies to effectively interpret them and act on them. And so let's get started. And I'd love to invite everyone who's viewing to pop in any questions that you have into the chat. And we'll even invite you, if you are willing and able to join us in the conversation a little bit later. So David, I'd like to turn it over to you to do a quick introduction of who you are and like what your motivations are in this space. And as you're talking, I'm gonna pop a poll into the chat that I'd love and invite each of you to respond to by just clicking your number to the answer to the question. So David, over to you.
Great, thanks Christine, and I'm excited to be here. So thanks for hosting me. And so at my background, so I've been focused on the broader agriculture and food space for the past 15 plus years. Most of that's been from an investment banking seat. I was head of agriculture coverage at Goldman Sachs, also worked at Barclays and Nomura. Uh, I worked at a ag tech startup, as you mentioned, the CFO, and then we also worked together at a VC as well, investing into this space. So a few different seats, primarily from the investment banking role. And recently, 6 months ago, I started my own firm, which is a boutique investment bank focused on this sector, agriculture and food, and working with companies of all sizes and shapes and stages. So from early stage to growth stage to very established, been around for decades, family founder-owned businesses and private equity owned, and anything in between, doing M&A and capital raising for companies. And so, very passionate about the sector. Have come to learn and love it and live it every day. And so it's an exciting place to be. And so I'm excited to be here today.
Yeah, and I mean, you've had a like long and storied career in the sector. You and I were chatting yesterday too about how it's great to feel like the sense of community. People who join agriculture tend to stay, throughout their career because it is such an important sector and really you can make such a big difference in it. But do you feel like times are different now? Like, do you have this sense of whiplash that I was alluding to in my opening comments?
So the level of excitement in the industry has definitely undergone a bit of whiplash and just excitement, all in, let's all jump into this, pulling back and just trying to understand, I think, have a longer term view, right? And I would say that everybody from startup founders to investors to corporates really got excited about the potential for ag tech. And we had a full cycle over the past 10 years, right? We were going from just being kind of a staid old industry and then starting, I would say, around 2015, starting to see, hey, there's innovation. We're starting to see some startups in a sector that previously didn't really have any startups. We're starting to get some outside external funding, and that's growing and growing. 17, 18, these are starting to be real serious investment dollars. 19 really growing in 20, and then clearly we had a peak in 2021, right? And since then, we've been kind of coming down and coming back to what I think is a new normal, right? Things feel bad versus where they were a few years ago, but we're still in a much better position than we've ever been historically. And it's now time to kind of start really thinking through what sort of businesses, what sort of business models are actually viable long term and what makes sense to build and fund, not just in the current environment, but also with an outlook of how can you be successful long term.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think, yeah, that this kind of like healthy recalibration of the sector. So let me ask you, like, what is hot right now? Where is capital flowing in 2025? You mentioned we had a peak in kind of 2021, and we've seen a free fall over the past couple of years. During that time, alt proteins were really hot and then they kind of dissipated. Then we heard about regenerative ag and the carbon markets. What's happening in 2025? What are the trends and the bets we should be paying attention to?
Yeah, I would say that we've moved away from a subsector being hot because it's got a huge addressable market, or there's this new thing that we haven't heard about before, to saying, okay, in every single subsector you can think of, from biologicals to agrobotics to alt protein to whatever it might be, right? Being saying like, okay, are we building a company that has a viable product in a market that either needs it or doesn't really understand it needs it, but has such a strong value proposition that it's going to become critical? And are you doing that in a way that is sustainable and fitting for this market,
Mhm.
right? And so the easy answer to that is saying, can you build companies that have revenue and are on their way to profitability and hopefully reaching profitability, right? That's I would say the super easy, concise answer of what's hot right now, which is revenue generating companies with profitability. But
Mhm.
if you kind of zoom in a bit more on what does that mean for companies, it's not about hey, we're just trying to latch on to a story or a secular trend and ride the wave, right? It's about, are you putting together a viable business for whatever it is that you're doing? Are you funding yourself appropriately, and are you spending your cash and capital appropriately rather than just trying to raise as much capital as possible and either focusing on top line only or business diversification or hiring employees or whatever it is? It's just trying to position yourself in a way that, okay, what actually is your company's value proposition? And so we're seeing success stories in every single subsector today. Some are a bit more challenging than others. Some, might have a few more successes, but it's now become a point where I think we've reached, and kind of coming back to my original comment, more of, I think, a longer term perspective, and stepping back and saying, like, look, let's look at this sector, let's look at this industry, how it's evolved over time, and how are you going to fit into it? Because I think the thing that I always look at when I look at this sector versus if you compare it to tech is, if you're an incumbent, you usually have a pretty large defensive moat. It's either in IP and technology, or it's in hard assets, right? And whatever it may be, it's pretty hard to disrupt you, and it takes a long time. And so, just as it's hard to disrupt the existing players, it's also hard to actually successfully become the disruptor, right? Whereas you compare it to other sectors, you might rise fast and you might disrupt everybody and it'd be great, but you also have a relatively limited defensive moat. And so you can quickly get disrupted here. And so I think if you have that mindset of, like, look, this is tough and you have to build strong foundations. Once you have that strong foundation and you build your castle, so to speak, that moat comes around it, and it stays there for a pretty long time.
So, and it's basically, I mean, these are business fundamentals. These are good business practices, no matter what. So, do you think over the past years that because there's been this influx of capital and a lot of hype around certain spaces, that we just had people coming in, like, yeah, bringing an idea that had no chance? Or do you think we had good companies that haven't made it because they're up against a lot of challenges that face the food and agriculture sector? Just because of the nature of this sector. We are dealing with powerful incumbents. We are dealing with farmers that tend to be, risk averse in many cases and hard to crack when it comes to adoption of new technologies, right? We're dealing with diverse and fragmented consumers, heavy regulations. So where do you think this has landed? Have we just had, like, naive companies, right, riding the hype wave? Or is it because of the nature of this sector that it's been really hard to break through, and now we're just seeing the strongest survive?
I would say it's unrealistic expectations.
Mhm.
So I don't think it's naive companies per se, but they were put into a position of saying, okay, in order to be successful, you need to grow, and you need to grow at a rate that really has never been experienced in ag before. Maybe a few exceptions, but every company was supposed to grow like a tech company. And so everybody came and they were able to raise capital, and they had good fundamental ideas, right? They all started with something that was truly unique and proprietary, but it's, what do you then do with it? And I think it's fitting the business model to the sector you're in, and making sure that, okay, this is actually a realistic growth plan, and it takes time to adopt new technologies in the sector. It takes time to build new manufacturing assets if you have a manufacturing business, right? If that's applicable to what you're doing. It takes time to build distribution networks for selling it on the commercial side, right? All these things take a bit of time. And so I think it was overall market exuberance, right? And everybody contributed to it, right? It's not one party that was at fault. It's, I think, like when you see anything else in any other types of bubbles, right? Everybody gets excited. It was fantastic because we put such a spotlight on the sector that it never had before. And all these people were all of a sudden being like, oh, what's ag tech? What's food tech?
Yeah.
Well, I want to be part of that. And I think that's great. But then the problem is you always get the naysayers and the people that want to point out all the negatives. And so they join at the peak, and all they see is is downside. And so unfortunately, right, that's a lot of the headlines. But then you wean those people off, the people who are actually really part of this sector stay, and they're now having a much more realistic business. And so I think we're in a much better position now in terms of stronger companies, stronger startups, and large incumbents willing to take in external innovation than I think we've ever been in before.
Okay, that's interesting. So I want to double down on that point actually, because we've seen corporate venture capital groups actually play a big role in helping to invest and galvanize this sector. But in 2025, there has been some rollback of this, most notably FMC Ventures has unexpectedly been dismantled, right? Affecting some of our friends. And I think that was potentially a signal to the market that CVCs, aren't actually working in the way that they expected to in the agri-tech space. And perhaps corporates and incumbents are taking more of a M&A driven or short-term return focused approach versus long-term venture bets. What do you think, the role of CVCs is kind of now and going forward? Is what happened with FMC Ventures a sign that may be impacting other parts of the industry? I've talked to some other CVCs who are really slowing down activities this year due to the market. And yeah, it's not boding well, it seems, for a lot of startups that were, counting on this, right, for scale up opportunities. So yeah, what's your interpretation of this?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see that evolution of where the corporate VCs have, where they came from, where they went, and kind of where they are now, right? And so I think people or companies and startups always have this expectation like, oh, it's a huge stamp of approval. Oh, it may be kind of a toehold into the company to get an acquisition. And I think that was true, very true, if you looked at their investments from 25, 15, 10 years ago. But then corporates changed and they started building full real venture teams. They weren't one-off making investments because they were saying, hey, that technology, that company is really something special. So we have to be part of it. They went to saying, here we have a pool of capital, we're hiring a team to manage it, and we need to deploy that capital. And so I think that capital started to become pretty easy for startups to get, and corporates themselves didn't really know what they were kind of what the overall purpose was of their internal funds, right? They would say like it has to have something to do with what we do. We want to have some strategic insight, R&D insight, but it's like, what do you get out of it? And so it was, I think, became kind of like, oh yeah, everyone should get some CVC investment because it's relatively easy to get it too. Now it's being difficult. And so where I think we stand now, right, and how companies should think about it is corporates, and speaking to many of them, most of them that have CVCs, they're managing it now with a very much more financially focused lens. Right. Before it was strategically driven, the financial aspects and the performance wasn't important. Now the financial performance is probably as important, if not more important, than how it fits in strategically with the company. And so what you should be thinking about from dealing and getting investments from them is what can you benefit from it? Any corporate investment should come with some sort of strategic partnership, strategic venture, strategic collaboration with them. It's not just a check, because that logo and having that investor doesn't really mean much the way it used to, really doesn't mean much at all anymore. It used to mean a lot. Now it's just another investor, but they can add real value in being a development partner for, if you're doing biologicals or robotics, if you need their help in accessing the market and the commercialization side, saying like food ingredients and anything in food. There's so many different examples of ways that strategics can be very beneficial to you, and I think that's where the real value lies. And so that, you should understand kind of what they're offering you. It's not hey, this is the first step to be acquired by them. That's really not how they approach it and how they think about it. It's they have something to gain from this relationship with you. You have something to gain from this relationship with them, and really treat it as a equal kind of partnership in that manner. You're on mute.
Sorry. I said, I think that's really great, practical advice, but I do have a question on that front, which is the fact that, in, the glory days of investment, strategics were coming in and really investing, as you alluded to, in kind of disruptive technology because it was like an interesting business, and not even necessarily associated with the core business of the company that they're affiliated with. Now, in these tougher times, we're seeing that this kind of strategic partnership where it can enable manufacturing or commercial opportunities is important for both sides, right? A more of a strategic alignment. But what does that mean for somebody who is actually trying to disrupt the status quo, or who has a solution or technology that threatens a core business, for example, of an ag input company? Is a strategic a valuable partner in this case, or should they be looking elsewhere? And if so, where?
So I think we should all have some humility, and I think we should learn from the hubris of you're a startup and there's no way you're going to be good at everything in the chain, right? There is the R&D side, and there's, say it's discovery, you might be fantastic, but then development is different. Or maybe you're good at all of that and you're fantastic at product development, and maybe it's precision ag software, whatever it is, right? There's that piece. There's manufacturing, which is a totally different skill set than R&D and new product development. There is commercial and market access, which is a completely different, not just skill set, but just actual people and access to the market than all the others. And so I think it's incredibly rare. We will always have examples of companies that are able to do it on their own successfully, but they are the exception. And so I think what anyone should come out of this is like, what are our strengths? Let's play to our strengths. That's where we have real value. But let's understand where we need to rely on other partners. And so I think that the key is just like, understand your strengths and weaknesses and try to get as much help where you were the weakest.
Yeah. I think that sense of humility is a great point. And it's something to at GIGA, when we are working with startups, that we really try to work with them on, is like fostering that collaborative spirit. And you do have big visions and go getter ambitions. But I think it's really important to remember that, yeah, you're not great at everything, and that having strategic partners that can enable your journey to go further faster is critically important. But that said, it is important for both sides to understand, of course, that, the incumbent organizations do move slowly, right? And can actually also sometimes have misaligned incentives about what this technology can do in the world, right? And we've seen that before. So I think it is, it's a fear, and it's just like, have your eyes wide open, that sometimes they will slow you down or even shut you down to protect their competitive position.
Yeah.
So
and
that's
that's
why,
a good point, right?
Yeah.
Which is, I'm not saying rely on them or think they're going to solve it. You need to find a way that you both benefit and you both have control over the success of whatever your partnership may be, right? Because
Yeah,
that
and
is a
that's
very
really,
good point,
Mhm.
right? Don't just be like, oh yeah, we put it, they're going to sell it for us. Fantastic. Why? They have no incentive to sell your product over their others, or they're going to develop this product for us. Why? Right? That what's the incentive for them, right? Make sure that you have equal or more control in this, and it's a full two-way partnership, not one-sided.
Exactly. And that's where people like you and our team at GIGA can advise and support startups, right, through this kind of negotiation and collaboration process. Not to get too self-promotional here, but just wanted to mention it. There's something else that you and I were talking about. We were together at World Agri-Tech in San Francisco, and both of us had an interesting observation about a new crop of investors that were showing up, and that is the private equity players. Can you provide a little intelligence on like what private equity is doing now in this game, and what opportunities this might present around scale up and investment?
I think it's fantastic to see investors, and really not just investors, but potential acquirers coming into the space that weren't in there previously. And so we're seeing private equity identify this sector as a sector that has both kind of a kind of middle market potential to it, the same way so many consumer industrials, anything manufacturing has always had a strong private equity presence of like, hey, there's so many companies out here, let's actually get involved and be a source of capital. And then two, which I think most people are get super excited about, is can they create platforms and do roll-ups? And so that's been, I think, the talk of both startups of saying like, hey, why let's just be part of a roll-up, and then also private equity trying to see what is possible in this sector versus what may be difficult. And so they're in the early stages. What the positive I see is there's more private equity looking at this sector than I've ever seen before. So that's a huge positive. There's more private equity funds that are just dedicated to this sector than I've ever seen before. And you're seeing at least a commitment to deploy capital into it, right? We have seen some specific investments, but it's still relatively early stages in it. But I think the positive there is the old view of this sector was if we're going to be acquired, it's got to be one of the strategics, right? Be it either big five in crop inputs, one of the three big OEMs in machinery, or one of the big food ingredient companies or F&F houses, right downstream. And so having to rely on just a very small set of acquirers isn't a path to success, especially as we see they are becoming less acquisitive of willing to pay for technology. And so having a new potential exit asset class, I think is going to be incredibly important for the success of this industry, because that's where we're going to really see real value created. When you have larger capital pools coming in and having a mid to long-term outlook of saying, hey, there's value here, and we can look to potentially combine some of these companies together to make a much stronger company.
I love that. That's also been a dream of mine, because oftentimes what we see with startups is they offer a piece of the puzzle, but the value proposition isn't as strong as if they were being combined into something that is more valuable, for example, to a grower or to the industry. So do you think PE is going to play that role in helping to do integration of solutions? And do you think their capital is more patient than, for example, VCs or the incumbent CVC, or business development teams that might be interested in companies?
Well, that last question is an interesting one. So look, they're definitely going to be helpful, I think, in building some new companies and some combinations that haven't existed. And we've already seen some of those already happen in the space, and those are the ones that people point to typically as examples, right? So like Rovenza is probably the darling of the industry, where people talk and show that how that's been private equity owned actually two different times, and how they've continued to grow that business and acquire new companies into it. All right. And so I think that's one, and we can talk about that in a bit more detail of what is that playbook that's been used there. But that who's more patient and who's going to be more supportive. So I would remember this. So I think by definition, strategics and VCs have a longer time horizon than private equity. That's true. However, their ability to be patient, especially VCs, a lot of it is reliant on raising new funds and being able to continue to fund their portfolio companies into the future. And so, yes, they're patient in one way, but then there's also continuous pressure if you need to continue raising capital. If you don't need to raise more capital from them, then they're very good patient investors. But depends on what stage you are at as a company of how, what fit they are. Private equity has a shorter time frame, but once they make the investment, they made that investment and they don't need additional capital for it. And combined with typically, not all private equity firms operate the same way, but typically they have a controlling stake. And so they're working with you and tied to the success of the company as much as any of the founders or management team or even employees, right? Because everybody is tied to the success there. It's a much more concentrated portfolio that they have. And so they're going to work with you or work with the company to make sure that it's a success. So I would say it's they're kind of different pathways, but I do think that they show to a certain extent a bit more patience in a way. But at some point you will need an exit, right? And so that's where things change, right? It's like after 5+ years, there's always movement and building towards an exit. Whereas I think that's less the case, and you're a bit less pressure from some of the other sources of capital.
Interesting, yeah. And before we move on to another topic of conversation, which is tariffs and trade and regulation, I do want to mention one other interesting signal that I'm seeing from my vantage point around private equity, which is they're actually buying land across the US, in California, for example, but also globally. And this is an interesting, play because they're vertically integrating agricultural supply chains. And I've been talking to some private equity players who are doing everything now from genetics to soil amendments through to marketing and selling products, directly to consumers. And so this could also be an interesting opportunity for startups because they're really looking at efficiencies, right, in the land and the model that they're building. And so innovation can help to make that possible. Of course, if the unit economics is right, right? So what I found in my conversations with PE is that they're very interested in, just a cost play. Is the innovation going to make me more efficient and more profitable? Then we'll buy into it. It's less of a sustainability message, actually, in the conversations I've been having. I just wondered if you had seen any of this or heard of any of this and what your thoughts might be.
There are increasing views on broader vertical integration. I do think it differs between investors, how they're seeing it. But what I see this playing out into, the trend that I see more is families and founders, so founder-owned businesses, but also family-run operations, either businesses or farming, are becoming much more open to third-party capital in a way that 10 years ago just they were not open to it and never wanted to sell. Now they've seen successes happen. They've seen their competitors or their neighbors do it, and where it's been a successful story for all parties. And so kind of either selling their businesses or selling their farmland, but then continuing to farm, or figuring out a way to either partially monetize or fully monetize their life's work is increasing. And so definitely a increasing level role that institutional capital plays in the broader sector.
Thank you. And now, before I jump into the next topic, I just want to remind everyone to please pop any questions that you have into the chat. And also, if you can, respond to the poll and let us know what's on your mind when it comes to interpreting market signals. Thank you very much. And so, Dave, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about, policies, right? Regulations, tariffs, everything that's going on. We've been seeing a barrage of announcements coming from the Trump administration around global tariffs. That's led to retaliatory measures from places like the European Union, where, I'm based in Europe, like Brazil, Canada, everywhere in the world, actually. So what does this mean for startups, right? Is this going to have any short-term implications? What does it mean around the funding environment and growth environment?
It's definitely affecting the current funding environment, that's for sure. And the reason for that is just uncertainty and volatility in current markets, right? So depends on which investors you speak with, but most of them, especially if they're more institutional and larger and have multiple asset class and funds, for them, they are much more tied to these overall macros, and they're being very, very hesitant right now. And so it's kind of putting a pause on capital deployment. Now, if you're an early stage VC, it should have less of an impact on you. You're much more longer term oriented, though you may start thinking about, companies that are either focused fully into one country or one region might start to have a bit more value, and companies that have a bit of a shorter supply chain, maybe that there's more value there. And so we're definitely seeing it hit the market. And then there's positives that come out of it too, which is like we are in the middle of some M&A situations of US based producers of agriculture. All of a sudden their values going up, their premiums going up, right? If most producers, when they're getting large enough, they're starting to integrate, with this, at least with this North America example, but I think it's true if you can apply it in most other regions. But you have most large producers started to be in the US or to go to Mexico, or be in Canada, or they're Canadian producers that started to go south to US and Mexico. And then having a fully integrated supply chain when it comes to food made sense. It was good for the consumers. It was good to be able to produce products 12 months a year. But now we have an unwinding of what's been a 30-year kind of buildup in our food infrastructure, so to say. And so there are some opportunities, and so we just need to be mindful of where things end up. And the problem is it's still very uncertain, and so we're not in a position where you can place long-term bets yet, because anything can be changing at any time. But so you got to be aware of it, and you got to kind of patience to ride the storm out, so to speak. But there's always, with anything, there's always opportunities that arise.
Exactly. And I think that's really interesting what you were mentioning about in the US, right? It's creating some opportunities, for people that have a localized and vertically integrated production. I would surmise that that would apply to other parts of the world. We've actually been seeing kind of like a renationalization of the food security agenda since COVID supply chain disruptions, and more governments stepping up and saying, we don't want to rely on imports. We actually want to bolster local fertilizer production, which has created opportunities for local biologicals companies. We want to make sure that we're not reliant on food imports, but actually how do we transition to become, food secure in places like Malaysia or LATAM or, even the Middle East. So do you think this is something that startups have a chance to incorporate into their messaging, right, as an opportunity, right, to get local funding if possible, right, and to be part of like making food security renationalized wherever they are in the world?
Yes, it definitely is an opportunity for sure, right? And the question is, I think what we don't know is kind of how will things actually materially change, or people adapt to what the new normal is,
Mm.
or are there new, so to speak, geopolitical allies that you want to be aligned with, right? But it is,
Which are shape shifting in real time. Allies are enemies and enemies are allies. We don't know what's happening. But
right.
yeah, so you think it's like, so what would your very practical advice be to startups as they're like developing their pitches and, developing their growth strategies, like with this volatility, like you said, it's like weather the storm, but how do you do that very
Yeah,
tangibly?
and I mean, look, if you're in, I think just for ease of actually controlling and running the business, try to have as short of a supply chain as you can. And
Mhm.
from a commercial perspective, focus on one market and just be really good and do it really well in that one market, because you're not gonna gain full market share, whatever that percentage might be in that market from the get-go. You don't have to start expanding and selling across into 2 continents or more. You don't have to be in multiple, I mean, the EU may be a bit different, but you don't have to be in multiple countries at once, right? Just figure out where you're starting, and just really do well and kind of conquer that initial market. I think that'll set you up for success, both from not overstretching yourself, but then starting to be viewed as more of a local player.
Mhm. Absolutely. And tapping into those like local capital opportunities and partnership opportunities. Great. And then let's talk about another kind of like uncertain area, which is regulation. I've been working, very closely with a few biological startups, and it's been really interesting to see that while there is kind of flux in the EPA and FDA in the United States, Other markets, such as Brazil, are going full steam ahead around approvals of new biological products, almost leapfrogging ahead and becoming the first market, right, for approvals of innovative products. So yeah, what is the state of play when it comes to regulation, and what advice do you have, again, for solution builders as they're trying to navigate regulatory approval processes?
I think focus on one market from a commercial perspective and regulatory perspective, and understand how you can plan it. And I think just have that be your initial roadmap for your early stage success. I think there's opportunities in Brazil, but commercial access and successfully operating Brazil is challenges. There are challenges there, but it's a huge market, and if you focus there, you can be incredibly successful. Same with the U.S. Same with, depending on what you're working with in Canada. Same with the EU or other geographies across the world. I mean, India, is just as a huge market on its own, and plenty of other geographies across the world. But it's just understand those regulatory aspects and how to how to maneuver them, right? I think regulatory, at least for me, you typically jump to biologicals and crop protection, but there is a lot of other aspects of regulatory, right? Like the approval of new novel foods, right? Cultivated protein is a good example, but plenty of other new food ingredients that are done differently in the U.S. versus EU versus other jurisdictions. But see where there's opportunity, and see how you can see how you can actually get fast approval, understand the market, do it successfully, right? And so like for example, in Europe, I know with biologicals, a lot of companies have gone and tried to get approval through emergency use authorizations. And I think that's been a great strategy. You get your product to market quicker, you have your customers advocating on your behalf, and it's, I think, just a very symbiotic relationship that works. Now, you don't have the registration, and like the counter in Europe is like the real registration, full registration takes a lot longer, is harder than the US or Brazil, but you have this kind of backdoor shortcut, but then you have to redo it every single year. And so figure out what works for you. A lot of companies are kind of using this backdoor emergency use authorizations on biologicals for many crops, many diseases or pests in many countries, right? Maybe that's the right pathway for you, or you're a row crop focused company doing whatever it is you're doing. And so Brazil's better, or US is better, or Canada, whatever it might be. And so just figure out what is the right thing. But I think stretching yourself too thin across multiple ones in this current environment is not a recipe for success.
Well, and I think you're highlighting something that, again, a little shameless self-promotion for the work that we're doing together at GIGA, and this is something we've been supporting startups with, is actually developing a strategy before diving into getting regulatory approvals and hiring an agency to submit dossiers. It's like step back first and say, like, what is your strategy? And really looking at the landscape of opportunities and being, quite like strategic with your decision making. I'll give another anecdote here. I've been working with a biological startup, and for investment reasons, it makes sense to position themselves as a biofungicide. For commercial access, biostimulant is a better path forward for them to get quicker access into a market and a commercial partnership with an incumbent player. So it's like one of those things where, we've had to sit together as a leadership team and really just evaluate, like, in some markets, we're going to go forward as a biofungicide, because there's enabling regulations, in other markets as a biostimulant, so that we can get to acres faster, right, and get those commercial partnerships that we're seeking. And that was something that actually we had to take a step back and really have those strategy discussions. And it saved time and money in the end. They had like already been working with an agency that was helping them file dossiers, but it was a bit like scattered and all over the place, and just really like a blitz. without that taking that step back. And once we did that, I think it really elucidated like a better path forward, again, to avoid costly mistakes in the long term and carve out near-term opportunities that, were a bit unseen before. So I think just, yeah, like you said, focus and then taking the time, slow down to speed up, right? To develop the strategy and seek that advice from people like us, who have decades of experience in the space and have kind of seen it all, right? And can help to ask the questions and push you as a startup, right, in the right direction. And I think that's a really good point. It's not just about biologicals and environmental release regulations, but it's about novel food regulations. And we've been seeing too that different markets, such as Singapore, and I've seen some of these efforts, popping up in the UK, for example, around regulatory sandboxes, which I think is also really interesting and allows a little bit of freedom to operate as regulatory systems are being developed, right, around some of the breakthrough technologies such as lab-grown meat and more. So getting that strategic oversight of everything going on is definitely worth taking the time and spending, the effort to do as a team. Um, yes, and then I wanted to ask, just kind of like as we're in the final 10 minutes of this, great conversation with, we could spend hours on each of these topics. But if you had to give like very practical advice right now to startups that are, in a stage of like maybe growth or maybe about to enter a growth trajectory, what would be your like checklist, top 5 things to take a minute and do as a founding team, as a leadership team, when it comes to raising investment and getting commercial traction?
So first and foremost, get to profitability. And now realize that that's easier said than done. Many companies are much more R&D focused, and you can't necessarily do that. But the essence of that is not from a valuation perspective. It's a ability to control your own destiny. And so if you can get off the fundraising hamster wheel, so to speak, that you're in a much better position, right? And so it's hard to raise capital today. We've seen so many companies that are just continuously capital raising, and also CEOs that just become professional capital raisers, and that's all they do.
Yeah.
And then they have other members on the team that are basically running the company. And there are examples where that's actually worked out successfully, but for as a whole, I think you really want to be focused on the company. And so it's a matter of just try to get to a position, and there's other ways to do it, right? Because you can't always get to profitability, depending on what your business model is. But say you raise a lot of cash, like be very diligent of how you deploy it and be as capital efficient as possible. If you have a lot of cash sitting in the bank, you kind of control your own destiny. It's the same thing at the end of the day. And so just don't
Yeah.
be over reliant on having to raise capital in order to just stay alive. So that's one, first and foremost, above everything else. That's the top one, right? But after that, it is really about just going back to just a lot of business fundamentals, rehashing what we've already discussed here, right? But just focus, have a clear strategy and focus area, right? And so narrow it down to a specific market or geography or regulatory regime. Make sure that you understand and can develop your products, that it's the best fit. Show how, get a product out there, right? I mean, just the typical kind of MVP thing, if you can, right? Some things that are regulatory driven is harder to do, but other products you can get out there. And so try to show revenue, try to show traction with customers. You're going to consistently be learning, and your customers will be giving you really valuable feedback. And so it's just building on that. And then lastly, there it is, and maybe coming back to the very first comment that Christine and I both said, which is the ag community is relatively small, and this sector is relatively small compared to other sectors. It is very much a community. And so you can find people that you can work with, you can find partners that can provide a lot of value to you. And so try to find those. They don't necessarily need to be investors. If they're investors, that's fantastic. And it's a great way to both get capital and do a strategic partnership. But you can also do many partnerships with companies and um, being able to help you complement you where it's not your strengths.
Well, exactly. And that's a key part of the GIGA model. And one other thing I just want to ask you to comment on is the role of telling your story, right? Is how do you think companies should play on that front?
It's it's incredibly important. It's got to be crisp and clear, and it's got to be focused on what is special about you, right? And
Yeah.
so the one thing I would say is what has changed from 5 years ago. We were at the peak of the market. People were telling stories that were about market size and TAM, and like, look at this growing trend. We're going to be a part of it. We're going to ride the wave. There's no wave. We're sitting and it's a nice comp pool, which is actually a nice thing in certain ways, but it's about you in terms of the company, in terms of your technology. And so emphasize what makes you like, what is your specific value proposition? What makes it proprietary? And what have you actually executed and accomplished to date? Focus on that and focus on, you don't have to focus, no one's really paying attention to the 5 or 10 year out projections and milestones. Focus on near term milestones. And so just be as tangible as possible. And so that's what investors are going to respond to in this current environment. They want to see what you've done, how you've been successful to date, and how you're positioning yourself for the next 12 to 24 months to continue to be successful.
Do they want to hear you talk about sustainability and carbon and regenerative ag, or are they over
Yeah,
that?
no, yeah, yes, but it is not the main, you don't lead with it. It's not the main story, but it is still important to almost every investor. And so you want to be able to show how you can benefit climate in some way and how your business is sustainable, right? I think it's hard to be an ag and food innovator without having a sustainability angle to whatever it is that you're doing today, but just make it clear, make it one of your investment highlights, but don't lead with it in this current environment because that in and of itself is not a reason that investors will be attracted to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, David, for your time and insights today, and also your very practical, actionable advice to everyone. And just as a reminder to all of our viewers, Giga and Verbitsky Capital are here to support you actually in developing these strategies so that you can grow and scale cost effectively and effectively so that you can make the impact that you're capable of and go Giga despite any market headwinds or uncertainty that's surrounding us. As we close out the call, I'd like to invite anyone who may have a question to quickly, raise your hand, come on video if you're so inclined. I'd like to welcome, oh, there's my good friend Asher. Hi, Asher. He's a farmer. Hey there. Hey, do you have
Good
a
to see
minute?
y'all.
Hey, do you want to say a couple of words about what you're doing? And are you in a tractor right now?
I am. I'm trying to put a prescription into this precision machine.
Amazing. I love it. Straight from the
Yeah.
farmer. Great. Yeah. So Asher, tell us like what you're doing, if you don't mind, really quickly. Yeah, to introduce
Yeah.
you.
We're running a diversified regenerative and organic farm in Middle Tennessee and kind of direct marketing and wholesale space. And we're getting ready for our corn cropping season. And I have a field that's got some bizarre drainages in it and am inputting some slope maps to figure out where I can use tillage because we're certified organic. So there's no herbicides so tillage is a tool in our toolbox here for field preparation. And so yeah, in that space. And it's pretty new for us. This tractor is the first time I've used precision was last season. And so this is a more advanced kind of setup and troubleshooting some of the technology to essentially get this shape file that we built in GIS into the tractor so I can see those slopes and make sure that I'm not tilling in an area that is, where erosion will happen. So that's basically what I'm doing
Yeah.
at this exact moment. But didn't want to miss the
Yeah.
call. Appreciate all the insights.
I really appreciate you joining. And I just wanted to say too that that's something we take very seriously at GIGA. which I developed in our previous organization, Thought for Food, was WTF, where's the farmer? And I think it's really important, going back to something that David highlighted, as companies are thinking about, their customers and getting to those revenues, they need to be in the head of people like you and understanding how they can make their product fit right into your real practices and to your needs and challenges. So talk to people like Asher and any farmer around you so that you can develop compelling technologies that can make a dent. Another really quick anecdote, I was in Mexico recently and I met a shrimp farmer and he was so skeptical of ag tech. He said, I would rather do an Excel sheet myself than come have these bells and whistles and expensive products that these tech bros bring to me that are over-engineered for my needs. And I thought it was a really interesting insight to hear straight from a farmer and actually bring into the work we do with startups. Talk to farmers and make sure you're delivering what they need. So yeah, thank you.
Great.
Well, let you
Great
get
point.
back to work. Yeah. And David, thank you again for your time. Thanks to everyone for joining. And let's go GIGA, everyone. Let's do this. 2025 is going to be the year for ag tech breakthroughs. So thanks again.
All right.
Have a wonderful
Thanks,
day.